Hello, my name is Lea Ypi. I'm a professor of political theory in the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I'm delighted to be at Darwin College tonight to talk about Are Revolutions Justified? I'm going to talk about the ethics of revolution. I'm going to dive into debate between moralists who think that revolutions are justified and legalists who think that reform is preferable. And I will try to cut across that divide by going back to the thoughts of a philosopher of the 18th century, Immanuel Kant, and to discuss the question of revolution in connection to the question of moral progress in history. I hope you enjoy the lecture.
Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our third Darwin lecture on the theme of revolution. Wonderful to see so many of you here, and apologies to those of you who are in the overflow room, but I hope you will enjoy it just as much. Over the last 2 weeks, as many of you will know, we have heard from the historian, Sir Simon Schama, on the disappointments of revolution, and last week from Professor Matthew Cobb on the genetic revolutions. If you missed those wonderful lectures, they are now available on the Darwin College YouTube channel, along, of course, with lectures from many of our previous years. We're very proud, of course, as Darwin College, of this lecture series, which has been running for 39 years now. I think the longest of any lecture series in Cambridge and possibly Oxford too. But the college itself is even older, and this year we are celebrating our 60th anniversary, having been established as the first postgraduate college at Cambridge University in 1964. Do look out on our website and social media for events that we are doing this year to celebrate our 60th anniversary. But tonight it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Lea Ypi to deliver her lecture entitled Are Revolutions Justified? Lea is a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. She's also an adjunct associate professor of philosophy at the Australian National University. She's a prolific academic and writer and has been recognized across Europe for, as one of the world's top thinkers in her field and indeed beyond. She grew up both in communist and post-communist Albania, and that experience and the experience of that transition was, of course, the topic of her most well-known book, probably, Free, Coming of Age at the End of History. A volume that was chosen as Book of the Year by, amongst others, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Financial Times, The Times Literary Supplement, The Spectator, New Statesman, Washington Post, and even the Daily Mail. So her research interests span normative political theory, Enlightenment political thought, Marxism and critical theory, and nationalism in the intellectual history of the Balkans, especially, of course, her home country, Albania. So, given that background, it's my real pleasure to invite you to join us for what I know will be an extremely well-informed perspective on the question, are revolutions justified? So, Lea, please.
Thank you very much to everyone for being here. It's a great pleasure and an honor. My title is Are Revolutions Justified? ? And those of you who stay until the end of the lecture may find out the answer. The first time I asked for a definition of revolution, I was about 11 in communist Albania, as was mentioned, and I seemed to be living one. And my mother was involved in the dissident movement that was trying to change things from state communism, state socialism, to liberal capitalism, and she talked about revolution all the time, how the revolution is going, revolution this, revolution that. And for me, at that point, revolutions weren't really a category of the present, of my daily life. They were the kinds of things that you studied in school. And so we studied the French Revolution, we studied the Bolshevik Revolution. Sometimes it looked like the English might have had a revolution. And I was puzzled because I couldn't really connect the revolutions of the past with this revolution that my mother was talking about. And so at some point I remember I asked her, so, Mom, what is the definition of a revolution? What is a revolution? And my mom, she gave me this long, inquisitive look. She probably thought I was a spy. And she just was shaking her head and she said, it's a mess. At which point I thought, yeah, okay, I know it's a mess, but what is it? How do you define it? And she said, don't do it. So, as you can see, I followed my mother's advice because I'm not here to do the revolution, I'm here to talk about the revolution. I mean, I doubt one would do the revolution or start it in Cambridge anyway, even if one wanted. But I hope to give you, and that's what I'm going to start with, a slightly more comprehensive definition than the one my mother gave me, which was that it's a mess. So I'm going to start with a definition of a political revolution, which is what I'm also mostly going to be talking about. There are many different kinds of revolutions, as you all know. There are scientific revolutions, there are revolutions in fashion, there are sport revolutions, there are revolutions in one's personal life. My topic is political revolutions. And a revolution, as we commonly understand the term, is an attempt, sometimes followed by violence, to create a juridical order that fundamentally changes the structure of political and economic relations. And I'm going to return to this definition as I talk about whether revolutions are justified or not. But for now, I want to draw your attention to two aspects of the definition that are really important to the argument that I'm going to be making. The first one, that a revolution is an attempt. And the second one, that violence is sometimes part of a revolution, but it's not always part of it. And that's important because we are all familiar with peaceful revolutions. And in the end, the one that my mother went through in Albania, and indeed the entire Eastern Bloc, was by and large a relatively peaceful revolution. In fact, it's known under the name of Velvet Revolution. In Albania, there were maybe 4 people killed, which is very peaceful by the statistics of revolutions more generally. And so, and it's important that we think about violence as not intrinsic to revolutions, and that we think of violence as not that which distinguishes reforms from revolutions, as sometimes people seem to assume. So, famous revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg once explained that reform and revolution are different methods of historical progress, but they don't get picked out, as she says, from the counter of history in the way in which we pick hot and cold sausages. And so we choose, do we want reform or do we want revolution? She says that those who oppose the method of legal reform to the goal of replacing an existent political order, it's not because they oppose a more calm and tranquil and slow way of doing things to the same goal. They choose a different goal. And the reason she was using this, she was trying to make this distinction, is that she thought a revolution is always the foundation of every reform. And as she explained, revolution is the act of political creation, while the legislation is the political expression of whatever a revolution has created. And so for life that comes to being with this revolutionary act and then gets settled and entrenched with reforms. And so in this way, every process of legal reform has as its basis a revolution. And that's why we don't think about the difference between reform and revolution as a question of violence or non-violence or peace or so on. The second aspect of the definition that I wanted to draw the attention at the beginning, which is also important to my argument, is that the definition of revolution, we said a revolution is an attempt to change the existing juridical order. And it's about the attempt rather than the outcome, because in the history of revolutions, we are also familiar with the category of a failed revolution. And so think about the Paris Commune, for example, that's a famous failed revolution, or think about the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 that led to the government of Imre Nagy. Failed revolutions, I'm going to be suggesting later, are just as instructive as successful ones. And as I say, this will be an important part of the argument. So now more broadly, the term revolution, as one of the most famous scholars of that phenomenon, Hannah Arendt, pointed out, originally started circulating in the 14th, 15th century, initially with reference to scientific revolutions. It was popularized by Copernicus to indicate the rotation of celestial bodies in the orbit following a certain circular motion in accordance with specific scientific laws. And this early scientific use of the term seems to have very little in common with how we use now the term in political discourse about revolution and this attempt to break with an old and obsolete social order. The scientific concept of revolution is tracking ideas of predictability, of foreseeable motion, of circularity, and on the other hand, and of conformity to laws more broadly, and on the other hand, the concept of a political revolution seems to be going in exactly the opposite direction. It's about treading through unanticipated paths, creating new political institutions. And so the concept of scientific revolution brings us closer to the workings of nature. The concept of a political revolution brings us closer to the concept of freedom. So there seems to be a discrepancy in the use of this term in these two different realms, but I think that discrepancy is just apparent, and it's actually settled if we think about how revolutionaries usually justify revolutions. And so what they say for revolutionaries, the kinds of political struggles to which they devote their lives, are seen as a return to a natural condition of justice that the old order has broken somehow. And so the idea is that the political revolution will return people to this concept of natural equality or natural rights, or however we want to understand that. And so in the words of one famous revolutionary, we wish to fulfill, this is a quote, the intentions of nature and the destiny of men, realize the promises of philosophy, and acquit providence of a long reign of tyranny and crime. So that was Robespierre. Virtue, Robespierre says, is natural in the people. And if governments neglect their interests, the light of acknowledged principles should unmask their reasons and their treasons. So both philosophers and revolutionaries knew, however, that this natural justice also has to have its champions in the political world in which we live. Otherwise, these principles would never become political reality. And so political activity, to cite another famous revolutionary, Lenin, who cites the socialist Chernyshevsky, political activity revolution, Lenin says, is not the pavement of the Nevsky Prospect, the clean, large, and smooth pavement in St. Petersburg. And those who ignore or forget this truth have paid the cost of numerous sacrifices. Or, as in a more colorful saying that I'm sure you're all familiar with by Chairman Mao, revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It can't be, Mao says, so refined, leisurely, and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous, end of quote. So revolutionaries know that they have to put up with significant emotional and physical harm, with humiliation, with hostility, with attempts to undermine their principles. But they remain committed to these principles, even though they know that these principles may not be feasible. In circumstances where they disagree, even amongst themselves, about what the best course of action is to advance the revolution, and in circumstances of high uncertainty more generally. And indeed, for that reason, often revolutionaries are the first to fall victim of their own attempts. And think about here the fate of someone like Robespierre or someone like Trotsky. So in fact, most of the time, the revolutionaries know that they will fail, that they might fail, and indeed they fail. But sometimes they manage, they succeed. And when that is the case, the revolutionaries of the past become the rulers of the present. So if their governments are now to be considered legitimate in the eyes of the whole people, they have to rule in the name of everyone and with their support. So they have to rule not just in behalf of the people who supported the revolution and the fellow revolutionaries who promoted their project, but also of everyone else, the people who were indifferent to their calls, the people who were ridiculing them, the people who were first convinced and then not so convinced, the people who actually tried actively to undermine their projects, the politicians who made decisions to persecute them, the bureaucrats who carried these decisions, the militaries who tortured and shot them. So they have to create the kinds of political institutions that, against this background of complicity in the old regime, rule in the name of everyone, including in the name of those that did not give them this allegiance in the first place. And for this to be possible, the defenders of the present order have to forget that they were revolutionaries in the past. And so extremism, that infantile disorder, to use Lenin's phrase, the kind of refusal to negotiate that characterizes the initial stages of revolutionary struggle, has to give way to compromise. And so this is why, from their point of view, the previous revolution, and indeed for the point of view of all revolutionaries, the previous revolution is always the last. So this is a natural instinct, and it arises from the fact that the more these new revolutionary institutions are perceived as the result of previous divisive struggles, the less secure the foundation of the new government is going to be. So legitimacy of the new government will be, or the new system will be undermined. But on the other hand, the more revolutionary principles that were initially obtained the hard way enter this realm of negotiation with their adversaries, or of compromise, or ongoing deliberation about what did these principles mean, how do they become laws, how do they become policies, what is their validity, the more the purity of that initial revolutionary spirit is sacrificed. And so justice will not have been fully done. So this is why revolutions, I think, apart from the characteristics of the revolutionaries themselves, are always inherently ambiguous phenomena. Because morality and moral principles are necessary to their genesis, and revolutions always have a moral justification. And I'm starting with the idea that revolutions are morally justified. We usually talk about reaction, or we talk about rebellion or insurgent if we don't mean that. We usually reserve the term revolution to a phenomenon that has a moral plausibility to it. But it's a condition of their success that that moral point of view that motivated them in the first place is then sacrificed and put to one side. And so that means that the means of revolution can be in tension with the ends of revolution, and that the genesis of revolution then stands in the way of their ongoing validity. So this tension, I think, is what explains why the question of the justification of revolution is subject to two different approaches. The people who criticize, that stands on grounds of institutional legalism, and the people who endorse it on grounds of individual moralism and idealist moralism. So the moralists think that since the ends of revolution are right, revolution can never be wrong. The legalists think that since the means of revolution are wrong, revolution can never be right. And what I'm going to do tonight is to revisit these arguments and hopefully offer an alternative that tries to cut across that divide and examine the question of revolution not in relation to the specific question of agency and justice of individuals, but based on a kind of philosophical theory of history that focuses on the contribution of revolutions to, and indeed failed revolutions, to collective progress. But before I do that, I want to briefly look at the arguments on both sides, so the moralists and the legalists, in a little bit more detail. So, in defending revolution, moralists hold on to the notion that there are some valid claims that trump whatever standing legitimate authorities, states, and so on might have. So, what is the valid claim? There are different ways of articulating what counts as a valid claim. Some people think there are human rights or there are natural rights. Some people think that's not a very good argument because rights are always in some ways given by a juridical order, so they can't precede the state. Some people who are skeptic of this language of rights say, well, there are interests, indeed important interests that people have, and that a state or an authority needs to track for it to have legitimacy. If you don't like the language of interest, you might say there are certain values that we expect authorities to reflect. The point is that our consent to be ruled by these authorities is conditional on how the laws of these authorities relate to the values that underpin them. And so the argument for revolution is that when these authorities don't reflect certain values or interests or rights or moral commitments, however you want to articulate them more broadly, people surely have a right to revolution, because surely, they say, they must be able to right the wrongs from which they suffer. Now, to this argument, the legalists offer lots of different responses. So the first one is a prudential response. They say, look, a lot of revolutions historically end up in carnage. They involve, in the best case scenario, widespread unrest, markets are not happy, protests, sometimes there is armed conflict. They can, depending on the degree of severity, result in significant harm to individuals or to communities. Often they lead to displacement of populations. And so actually, instead of establishing new rights, they often end up violating whatever rights are already there. The second argument that legalists give is, and I'm giving them in order of how I think whether they're persuasive or not. The second argument is about mechanisms of change. So a lot of critics argue that all other things equal, people should try to reform through legal channels, working with existing political orders rather than trying to replace them. And so they say the rule of law is really important to preserve justice and stability, and to the extent that revolutionaries position themselves outside the existing legal and institutional framework, they are not reliable guides to change, because the arbitrariness with which they come to power ends up sanctioning, legitimizing ongoing arbitrary behavior even once they are in power. And so this actually, I think, is what explains why even intellectuals who are initially in favor of the abstract idea of revolution, so they might be in favor of a general revolution or the notion of revolution, they actually end up disliking any concrete manifestation of a revolution. So think about Orwell's position vis-à-vis the Bolshevik Revolution, and think about the end of Animal Farm. A few years after the revolution, the farm animals witnessed Napoleon the pig playing cards with Mr. Pickleton, and Orwell gives us this devastating final sentence, and I quote, "12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which." Okay, I recently read on Twitter that one shouldn't really cite Orwell, and especially not Animal Farm, because apparently English graduates in Oxford and Cambridge are told that the people who cite Animal Farm haven't read any other books. I promise you, I have read other books. I just wasn't sure whether you had read them, so I'm giving you an example that might be helpful. Anyway, the point that is made by Orwell is a familiar one. Since revolutionaries themselves often end up betraying their principles, one might applaud revolutions in general, but end up concluding that in any particular case, a more gradual approach to change would be preferable. So that's the second objection to revolutions about the mechanisms of legal change. The final one, and this is the one that I find most persuasive, is the one formulated in the political writings of the philosopher Immanuel Kant. I picked Kant not just because I'm a Kant scholar, which is always a good reason to pick someone, but because Kant is actually famous for a rather strange position on revolutions, which is almost the opposite of Orwell's. He rejects revolutions in general, but he enthusiastically endorses one particular revolution, which is the French Revolution. And so in this sense, his attitude is the opposite of Orwell's, because Orwell likes the idea of revolution in general, he just doesn't like the concrete manifestations, and Kant has the exact opposite argument. Apparently, when Kant received the news of the installment of the Republic in France, he was about 65 years old then, and apparently he burst out and said, "Now I can say, like Simon, God, let your servant die in peace, because I've already lived this memorable day." And in case you were in any doubt on whether Kant withdrew his allegiance to the French Revolution when it turned sour, it actually became stronger. So around 1793, exactly in the kind of time in which the French Revolution had entered this darkest day of terror, and many of his colleagues had started to have second thoughts, and Burke was most famous about articulating the reasons for the opposition to the French Revolution, Kant actually became even more excited about it, even more enthusiastic. And one of his students and later colleagues, Friedrich Nicolaus, at some point reported that Kant insisted, and I quote from his report of Kant, that all the horrors that took place in France were nothing compared to those that people had suffered under a despotic regime, and that the Jacobins were probably right in all their actions. So Kant wasn't going soft on his acceptance of the French Revolution, but he's also famous for insisting that revolutions in general can never be justified. So a people, this is a quote from one of Kant's writings, "A people has a duty not to rebel, even against an unjust government. As Kant puts it, there is no right to sedition, still less a right to rebellion, and least of all there is a right against the head of state to attack his person or even his life." And he goes even further when he argues that, quote, "A people has a duty to put up with even what is held to be an unbearable abuse of supreme authority." Now, some scholars, including myself, have argued that Kant wrote this because the Jacobins at the time in which he was writing this were already in power, and so he wanted to make sure that they were protected from insurrection. And this goes back to the question of the revolutionaries of past to become the rulers of the present. But here I want to kind of argue against my previous self and take seriously the philosophical argument that Kant makes against revolution, and I think maybe just leave aside for a moment the kind of Jacobin club gossip about why Kant was on the one hand defending, on the other hand rejecting whatever political motivation he might have had. I think he also had a philosophical reason. And the philosophical reason was that Kant thought that the justification of revolution was incompatible with what he calls the transcendental formula of public right. Don't be scared. Transcendental formula of public right says that all actions relating to the rights of others are wrong if their maxim, that maxim is a subjective principle of action, if their maxim is incompatible with the principle of publicity. So the principle Kant thought that motivates a revolution, even against an unjust government, is inconsistent with the principle of publicity, because if the principles of revolutionary action were universalized, they would make their own purpose impossible. So let me unpack this a little bit more. Kant's argument against the revolution is the same one that he deploys across his writing, also in other similar instances. For example, to argue against European civilizing missions in other parts of the world, or also against what we might nowadays call humanitarian war, for example. So Kant's argument is that a group of people cannot unilaterally use coercion to change from the outside the structure of social relations that are already based on some kind of principle of right. And Kant grants that that principle of right might be inadequate, might be incomplete, might be exclusive in many ways. The point is that a people that has come together and recognizes a public law reflects a will to subject to joint rule, and that is a different situation from a people that are scattered in the state of nature without any public authority regulating their actions. So Kant says a state, however bad state it is a state. And it reflects a type of collective willing that is different from the anarchy of the state of nature, which is the worst type of anarchy you might be in. So the reasons for rejecting both revolutions and civilizing missions and interventions and so on are the ones that are the same. And the argument is that there is always a transition point where all public authority is destroyed and the conditions upon which the principles of right are grounded are destroyed as well. So in the state of nature, all claims hold provisionally because we're waiting somehow for a state or an authority to settle these claims between people, to regulate them through forms of right. When there is already a publicly recognizable authority and individuals become settled, they become publicly acknowledged in some form, the people's mutual submission to that political authority is the foundation on the basis of which agents can continue to make claims on one another. And so the problem that Kant has with the right to revolution and with revolutionary attempts is that they just undermine that, they destroy that. They are contradictory because the principle that motivates them undermines the basis on which those claims can be made. So just to put it very crudely, revolutions are morally wrong because they are based on principles that can't be universalized. And for those of you who are familiar with Kant's ethics and moral framework, for Kant, a principle is moral if it can be universalized, basically. So revolutionaries put themselves outside the sphere of publicly recognizable rights, and in so doing act unilaterally. But any unilateral act that is placed outside the context of public recognition is, for Kant, intrinsically wrong because it can't be made public, it can't be universalized. So what the revolutionaries do is that they put other people under coercive obligations, but outside the only context in which the coercive imposition of obligations is justified through a system of law. So I think this is a coherent position, and it's very hard to, I know we don't have time for questions later, but maybe during drinks if you want to discuss and challenge and so on, I find it hard to argue against this position. And I think it's a coherent philosophical position that is also revealed historically in the tension I started with between the revolutionaries of the past and the government of the present. That explains why, when the revolutionaries become government, their revolution is always the last one, and why they can't afford to say, well, now let's have revolution every time there is a problem with the existing legal order. And so the claims of revolutionaries, when the revolution is successful, shift from a claim of partiality, of being outside the state, to a claim of being identified with the purpose of the state. So my challenge now is, for the rest of the talk, is there a way to think about, to reconcile these claims? So is there a way of thinking coherently about, on the one hand, the historical desirability of revolutions in general, and the ambiguity and the contradictions and the denial of the right to revolution in all these particular cases? So my suggestion is that one way to think about this is to shift perspective and to focus not on the actions of particular individuals in existing political circumstances, but on the rationale for revolution from a more general standpoint. And the standpoint is what I will call, in a somewhat old-fashioned way, the species being. So what is the species being? The species being is a way of talking about humanity that goes beyond existing individual humans alive at any particular point in time, and that tries to think more holistically about humanity as a set of institutionally entrenched moral relations that is also temporally stretched. So if we distinguish these two perspectives, the perspective of the individuals and the perspective of the species, we might see how an event that is hard to justify from the point of view of agents at any particular point in time can be seen to contribute to progress from a more general moral perspective. And so, to put it in a different way, it may be misleading to try to answer the question of the justification of revolution by thinking about what authority a particular group has to make claims on behalf of everyone else. Instead, you might have a different strategy, a different way of looking at it, which is to reflect on revolutions by thinking about their contribution in history from a more general historical perspective. And in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to try and unpack what this means, and I will also help myself to some elements of Kantian thinking that I think are still plausible and valid for the present. So we already talked about the Kantian rejection of revolution in general, I want to now turn to Kant's philosophical arguments in defense of the French Revolution in particular. His defense occurs in the context of a famous essay called The Conflict of the Faculties, where it unfolds through a reflection on the question of progress in history, which is the following. Assume that we all acknowledge that we have moral obligations to each other. There is something like abstract morality. Is there any evidence in the world in which we live that these abstract moral norms have any purchase? And that was Kant's problem. Is there an occurrence, Kant says, or an event, or an empirical manifestation that can give us any hope that all of these abstract principles sometimes happen? Sometimes they motivate people, they make a difference in the world in which we live. Now, the difficulty that Kant acknowledges, and that is a difficulty in general with this question from the get-go, is that it has to do with the actions of free human beings. So people are both moral and flawed because they are free, because they have free will. So moral norms, they tell us what we should do, but we also know that people don't do the right thing. They don't follow always moral norms, even when they know what the moral thing to do is. So external circumstances, sometimes even internal circumstances, conspire against us. There is ideology, there is false consciousness, there is brute force, there are all these other elements in the world that stand in the way of the realization of the moral principles. So when Kant raises this question of progress, for him it means to say, is there any evidence of progress in history? It means to be able to single out an experience, which, as he puts it, as an event, which points to the disposition of human beings to actually follow moral imperatives rather than just break away from them. Now, to say that something is possible is not to say that it will happen, that it will occur. This is why Kant presents this argument about progress in the form of a conjecture. From a given cause, Kant says, an effect can be predicted only if the circumstances prevail which contribute to it. And even if these circumstances prevail, it would be difficult to conclude that they always lead in the favor of the realization of the moral principles. So all we can have is an analysis of not of the causes of moral progress, but of the signs of moral progress. And that's why Kant frames his whole argument on progress on this question of, is there a sign of progress in history? Now, it's really important that we don't talk about causes, but signs. Because if progress were causal, it would be reversible. And so if that were the case, we wouldn't actually have had the Holocaust after Kant gave his lectures on progress, and we wouldn't be on the brink of environmental catastrophe after my lecture. So a sign is just that. It's a sign. It's an empirically observable phenomenon of a moral disposition that tells us something about human beings more generally. And so here, we are looking for evidence not in the life of particular individuals, Kant says, but in the collective life of human beings more generally as a species or as a species being. And on this account, and this is where his defense of revolutions appears, revolutions constitute key events in philosophical history, and the philosophical history is a kind of history that privileges a moral point of view, that privileges an understanding of humanity in this collective way as this morally relevant set of properties and relations. And so for Kant, the French Revolution gives just that. And I'll say in a minute what about the French Revolution gives us that. It's a historical event that can be connected to this sign that sometimes human moral dispositions generate empirical effects in the world and have practical import. Now, why is the revolution the sign to think about progress in history? So here it's worth thinking about alternatives in the history of philosophy. One way to think about signs and models and alternatives is to think about signs of the great actions of the great men in history. Particular, what Hegel would later call world historical individual. That was a perspective that someone like Voltaire, say, took in his Siècle de Louis XIV. So that's one example, is to look at people and what they do for signs of progress. He also doesn't focus on the emergence and the decay of ancient, glorious political structures, which was another way in which people in his age were doing this. So you have Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy giving you examples of history of decay of communities or you have Montesquieu's considerations on the greatness and the decline of the Romans, in particular this whole literature on the Roman Republic. Kant focuses on something very different, and it's different because it's something that was just beginning to emerge at the time in which he was writing, in the 18th century, and that is the public sphere. So he focuses on the effects of the French Revolution on the public sphere. He focuses on the public reaction triggered by the French Revolution, or as he puts it, on the mode of thinking of the spectators to the French Revolution, and the attitude that they reveal publicly about the unfolding of revolutions, which Kant thinks shows us a, quote, universal yet disinterested sympathy for the players of one side as opposed to the other, even at the risk that this partiality could become dangerous for themselves. So it's really interesting to see that, unlike the justification of revolutions in general, it is the partiality of an impartial public towards the revolutionaries that Kant is celebrating when he says the sign of progress in history is the French Revolution's attitude, the reaction that it generates. This mode of thinking, Kant continues, is the wishful participation of the spectators that borders closely with enthusiasm, the very expression of which, of enthusiasm that is fraught with danger. So that response, Kant thought, the partiality of impartiality, showed us that human beings are capable of being motivated by feelings beyond their immediate self-interest. And it's this disinterestedness of the spectators that shows a sign of the moral character of human predispositions. So Kant is identifying a sign of moral progress in enthusiasm, and in the enthusiasm of those who take sides in favor of the cause of the whole humanity, and this is triggered by the disposition to act against self-interest, and this disposition gives us, as Kant puts it, a sensible manifestation of the power of moral ideas. So, why and how does the feeling of enthusiasm exactly contribute to giving us this visible sign of progress in history? What is the nature of the link between revolutions as a sign of moral progress and enthusiasm as the sentimental manifestation of that sign? And here there's two arguments that Kant, I'm not sure if Kant makes them separate from each other, but I think that one can infer from the kind of argument that he makes, which is, one is about, and I'm going to very briefly touch on each of them, one is about the shifting of the boundaries of political feasibility. And the other one is about the cultural effects of education. So let me start with feasibility. How many times have you suggested a radical idea or a proposal or a political vision, and people told you, well, that sounds really great in theory, but it doesn't really work in practice, does it? So when Keir Starmer was accused last year of breaking several campaign pledges, his reply was, I quote, "I have to be realistic about what is possible." So, in other words, I have to lie because it's a tough world out there. Now, what is and isn't possible is itself subject to different interpretations, and there are no hard facts in the world. Every fact is the result of an interpretation of a fact. And so our assessment of what is and isn't possible depends on how we balance our priorities, how we order the facts, what value we assign to that ordering of the facts. And there's a lot of different elements that contribute to making a proposal unrealistic. So people are seen to be self-centered, people are ideologically motivated, people are afraid to speak out, they can be manipulated by propaganda, they can be at the mercy of fake news, you name it. All of this was true in the time in which Kant was living, just as it is true in our time. But for Kant, the presence of revolutionary enthusiasm shows that people are capable of going beyond all that, and they are capable of doing that even when enthusiasm is fraught with danger. So enthusiasm for him was the visible sign of identification with actions that are advanced in the name of the whole humanity, but where we know that not the whole humanity is actually supporting them. And so it's in this conscious project of political liberation that we have a process through which people, Kant thought, become agents of their own history, and that is the kind of empirical sign that the Enlightenment, which Kant defined as the emergence from people's self-incurred immaturity, is actually possible in practice, not just as an idea. So, and that's because the circumstances we see from this participation, from this excitement about this kind of event, we see that circumstances are no longer controlling them, and authority is no longer accepted as given. So progress then becomes a question of not just what is the abstract guarantee on progress, but of taking ownership over your life. And change is even the kind of change that was thought to be completely unrealistic up to that point happens. So it's part of a teleological argument that Kant makes about history, a philosophical argument about progress in history, and this is the exact opposite of the deterministic view of history that most people present these days as a caricature of what Enlightenment teleology was supposed to be about, and that dominates contemporary rejections of the Enlightenment. So, because people say, you know, this view is creating these forces that are alien and so on. In fact, it's the exact opposite. What this view of progress does is instead of reifying circumstances, it demystifies them. And instead of reproducing the religious outlook, it actually dismantles it. So progress doesn't depend on what circumstances do for people. It depends on what people do with the circumstances and how others respond to this action. And so, as a result of all this, revolutionary enthusiasm is the moral feeling we experience when we realize that nothing is as settled as it looks, and that however much we think we are ideologically manipulated or controlled by alien forces or shaped by data controlling agencies, Facebook, Twitter, change does happen. And it is in those moments that humans come to see themselves as agents of progress. So this process is made of both continuity and rupture, and revolutionary achievements are, yes, events that rupture, but they are also built on the work of previous generations and of previous revolutionaries. And sometimes a leap forward is followed by leaps backward. So as I say, it is not necessarily a cumulative process that just works in one direction, but I don't think it matters because, as we said, we don't want a cause, we want a sign. We just want a possibility proof. We want to know that it's possible for people to do it. And so revolutionary enthusiasm gives us just that. Kant thought that why was the French Revolution the sign of progress? It had something to do with the motives of the revolutionaries. Of course, it had something to do with the target, with the goals of the revolutionaries. He thought that the age of the Enlightenment was an age that was characterized a little bit like ours by, on the one hand, the growth of trade and ever-increasing interdependence between states, commercial rivalries, processes of colonialism emerging, but also as a result of that interdependence by the achievement of a kind of cosmopolitan horizon that made us realize that when rights are violated in one part of the world, they might be violated in the other part of the world because of exactly the kind of interdependence. And so it's a world in which humans understand that no faith can save them except for the faith that they have in themselves. And we can't, and this entire argument about progress is connected to that faith. And it's a faith that I think we can't really afford to lose because we don't really have anything else going on other than that kind of faith. Now, other thinkers, and so as I say, it was connected to this argument about republicanism, how republicanism would promote peace in the world, would promote this cosmopolitan vision. And of course, a lot of authors after Kant challenged that diagnosis. So someone like Marx emphasized that, so long as we don't move beyond capitalism, there's no chance that the states can ever come to this peaceful settlement between themselves. They will always remain hostage to the global market injustices. Others have added that the Marxian analysis is inadequate because we don't just have conflicts of class in the world, we also have conflicts of gender and race, and we have to think about those kinds of antagonisms. Other people still add that humanity is too narrow, and so we need to think about how humanity relates to nature. And all of these are revolutions that we haven't had yet. But what they show is not that the Enlightenment project is flawed. They show that it's unfinished. So Enlightenment requires a kind of faith that can sustain itself, and it requires hope that despite the tendency of revolutions to backfire, to degenerate, to make a mess, something of that spirit is necessary to motivate believing in the possibility of radical change amongst human beings, and to believe that what was previously thought impossible can actually become real. Now, of course, we can also all find hope in our studies. You can find hope by reading a beautiful poem. What is important about revolutions and about the kinds of hope that they give is that they're not individual. They are collective events. They show hope and they sustain faith in humanity because it's about a type of faith that goes beyond the individual. It's about a faith that requires acting together with others to achieve certain goals and not just finding comfort reading a poem in your study. So again, it's not just for the individuals, but for the species. So for Kant, the French Revolution gives us this possibility of human beings overcoming obstacles to the construction of a more rational, more moral political world in which institutions are aligned with our moral commitments. And of course, that intervention, that belief in progress, is also conditional. It's not settled. It requires that people continue to sustain the belief and acting in a way that such progress occurs, because, as we said, there is nothing else. So, is this action unilateral? The actions of revolutionaries unilateral? Empirically speaking, it is. It's the work of a group. It's not the work of everyone. Not everyone will be behind it. There were plenty of people, as I said, that were hostile. In fact, probably the majority were hostile to the French Revolution. But for Kant, it mattered that revolutionaries acted in the name of these universal principles, and it mattered that they generated its response to their attempts, even if they were failed attempts. And that's because, and this is to go back to his previous legal rejection or argument for legally rejecting revolutions, the philosophical perspective on history is different from the philosophical perspective on the state. And this is, I think, where Kant goes beyond Hegel, for those who are interested in these debates. Hegel thought that the philosophical perspective is the perspective of the state. Kant thought that there was more to history than just the history of states, and I think Kant was better, and we can talk about that later. But it seems to be that what is difficult to understand from the point of view of the present can be justified with a look on the kinds of reactions that it generates. So do revolutions always work? They don't. Are they nevertheless valuable? Kant seems to think so. So now I'm just going to say something briefly about a different argument that one can also find in these discussions on progress in history, which is this aesthetic role of the more cultural role more broadly. While the political change that revolutionaries bring about is understood as a political change that has a bearing on transforming laws and reflect on how the laws on institutions track our moral commitments, there is a dimension of enthusiasm that has to do with the impact of revolutionary change on culture more broadly. So enthusiasm, Kant thought, is relevant to understand the effects of the French Revolution on moral emancipation as part of a broader process of moral education. As he puts it in the third critique, enthusiasm is the mark of a sublime state of mind. The sentiment is defined as the idea of the good with a moral effect and is a condition without which nothing great, Kant says, can be achieved. And the sublime is distinctive from other moral sentiments because it's different from, Kant thinks it's not just the respect for the moral law, it's connected to a distinctive type of aesthetic pleasure that arises from knowing that there has been an obstacle to the realization of morality, but that obstacle has been overcome. And this follows on all the more emotional, stronger identification with morality, in a way. So he thinks that the enthusiasm of the revolution has this kind of cathartic effect that has to do more with how moral education works more generally. And so enthusiasm is praiseworthy because it has an impetus and it influences agents' resolution then to follow the dictates of reason. In other words, it represents the power of moral ideas from a symbolic perspective. And in the third critique, Kant gives lots of different arguments for different examples of ideas that have these symbolically powerful effects on sensibility. So he talks about ideas of religion or of culture as cultivation of aesthetic sensibility. And the remarks that you find around the French Revolution are all aligned to this idea that the feeling of enthusiasm through which the sublime is experienced affects the spectators and is a testament to the ongoing cultural legacy of the types of enlightenment processes that Kant thought were in place at the time in which he was writing. But the nature of this process, and this is again to return to the point of view of the species, the nature of this process is such that it can't be completed during the single lifespan of individuals. And so the effects are of a kind that need to remain even when the event itself is gone. So humanist history for Kant progresses through these attempts to realize freedom, and the collective memory of those attempts at emancipation are inherited by future generations, even when the collective attempts themselves fail. There's another example. I'm going to cut this short because I'm towards the end of my time, but there's another example of a failed revolution, the Paris Commune, where Marx says something similar when he talks about the effects of the Paris Commune on the participants in that case, where he says, you know, the famous sentence about how the tradition of all the dead generation weighs in the like a nightmare in the kind of brains of the living, and so on. So we learn not just from the triumph of revolutions, we also learn from their failures. We think not just about what they've achieved, but also what they have left out. Now, you might ask, okay, why does this not apply to any collective event? So if it's about the experience and about the memory and the sentiments that these events generate, surely war has the same legacy on people's culture as a revolution. So you might say revolution produces great works of art and has a legacy on literature and visual arts and so on. War has the same. Why does Kant say it's revolution rather than war? And the difference is in the disposition. Wars make us give up on humanity. Revolutions don't make us give up. We try to affirm humanity through these revolutionary attempts. And so there's no enthusiasm with war. At most, you can have a kind of celebration of heroism. So the right attitude to revolutions of the past is neither one of outright nostalgia nor of outright rejection. The point is to insist on the relevance of the experience of revolution, including failed revolutions, for those who observe it either directly or through the history that they are a part of. And so we look back to previous experiences to find evidence of the power of moral ideas in the feelings of enthusiasm that lead to these transformative events. So I'm going to now slowly conclude. I started by saying that authors who examine the justifiability of revolutions are divided between the moralists and the legalists. My perspective was to try and focus not on the actions and aims of revolutionaries, but on the sentiments that are generated by the revolutions, and both thinking about them as units in space, but also as units in time, and to think about the way in which revolutions transform the conceptual categories and the normative boundaries that we are held by when we think about assessing the present. Across space, they contribute to change our judgment on the boundaries of feasibility. In a way, across time, they play this kind of morally educative role in developing a learning process from which future generations can benefit. So, I said I was going to give you the answer to the question, are revolutions justified or not in the end? Well, maybe that's the wrong question. I mean, no one's ever asked, can I please have a revolution, to some London or Cambridge academic before they were about to go ahead and make a revolution and then decided on the basis of the answer that we gave, whether it was okay to go ahead or not. So revolutions happen. They've always happened, and they will continue to happen, whether we think they ought to happen or not to happen. So what we need to recover is our ability to reflect on the contribution to this general question of moral progress that should interest us at any point in time, and to how any particular revolution promotes the interests of humanity as a whole. Now, These days, people think that to talk about the interests of humanity as a whole is to justify colonialism and imperial domination. I hope to have made it clear that that's not my intention. I mean, apart from everything, I come from Albania, and so we've never mattered very much. And it's not going to change with me, even though my English is all right. But more seriously, I don't think colonialism and imperialism had the interests of human species in sight, and they failed not because they were universal, but because they were not universal enough. And so the point is to try to understand that while the causes of political change are always bound up with empirical processes of conflict and cooperation, the way we address political challenges is, yes, different at different points in time, but ought to be inspired by something more general that touches, that goes across the specific point in time in which we ask the question. And so we need to learn from the past. And yet, to be able to learn from the past, we need to be able to see the past not just as a random series of characters and events that we can't put together because every time has its own standards and every people have its own criteria and it's not possible to travel either in time or in space, but to observe it from a philosophical perspective which asks, what is the point of view of the human species and how does this contribute to the moral development of the species? So that's why for me the question, and this is really my final two sentences, the question is not really whether revolutions are justified or not, but what we can learn to ensure that the next revolution actually learns from the mistakes of the previous one. And for that, Kant thought we need a universal perspective on reason. We need, as a result of that, a universal philosophical, moral perspective on history, and indeed a kind of philosophy of history that centers on revolution as the sensible sign of our moral progress as a species. So that's what Kant thought, and I think Kant had a point. So that's it. Thank you.
Lea, thank you so much for that clear, wonderful, thoughtful, eloquent presentation and lecture. It was magnificent. I said at the beginning that you are known and recognized as one of the great thinkers. You're also one of the world's great communicators, so thank you very much for that. It was fantastic. And so please come back next week, if you would like to, and join us for the next Lecture in the Revolution series by the psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist, who will be speaking on A Revolution in Thought, How Hemispheric Theory Helps to Understand the Meta-Crisis. So if you don't know what that means, come along. Thank you.